Good morning. I'm so very happy to see you here today to welcome our Crown Forum speaker, and we will be beginning very shortly. So just give us one moment. So I'm thrilled to be able to introduce President Saunders and to have a Crown Forum at Morehouse College, 150 years of existence, and I believe he's our first president of a national labor union. So I believe, yes, if I could get a little round of applause for his being here, I certainly appreciate it. Of course, we all know that our existence has been closely involved with unions. We come from working families, and we know that working families need to be protected by organized labor, working conditions, right? We cannot just assume the well-being of our working community. But we know that if our working community is well protected and well remunerated, we know then that the community is good. You know, we can expect to have the well-being assured. So let me do a brief introduction. On behalf of the Morehouse College community, I welcome our brother president, Lee Saunders, president of American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, AFSCME. AFSCME is an AFL-CIO affiliate with 1.4 million members in communities across the nation, serving in hundreds of different occupations. President Saunders was elected at the union's 40th International Convention in June 2012. Mr. Sanders is also the first African American to serve as AFSCME president. Morehouse College International Comparative Labor Studies, ICLS, is an emerging center dedicated to preparing our graduates to use the skills that they acquire to meet the challenges of organizing for good work conditions and sustainable work futures as the key to social equality and peaceful communities. Now, to give just a bit of background, Mr. Saunders grew up in a union household in Cleveland, Ohio. His father was a bus driver and a member of Amalgamated Transit Union, and his mother was a community organizer who, after raising two sons, returned to college and became a community college professor and a member of the American Association of University Professors. I can't resist saying that that's my own history, for my mother did pass that same pathway in Bronx, New York. Saunders' background is as a labor economist. He has served in the capacities of Assistant Director of Research and Collective Bargaining Services, Director of Community Action, and Deputy Director of Organizing and Field Services. He is an at-large member of the Democratic National Committee. He is president of Working America and the treasurer of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. He also serves as a board member of Priorities USA and the Democracy Alliance. So we hear from many organizations, and I think that's an important thing for all my students and our students here at Morehouse to know, that when you work with organized labor, you also work with all types of social justice organizations and think tanks. Without further ado, please welcome Mr. Lee Saunders, President of AFSCME.
Thanks, everybody. Good morning. Now we can do better than that. Good morning. I know that the numbers are a little bit smaller today because of the virus, but folks are watching on Zoom or their phones or whatever. I tell you, I will be so happy when we can all come back together without using those computers and see each other face to face and have that personal interaction, which I believe is so important, and we've got to get back to. And let me thank Dr. Hewitt for that kind introduction. We were sitting in the back room talking about our own histories, and she comes from New York City. You heard that I come from Cleveland, Ohio, but we were talking about our experiences of growing up and what's happening in our two cities right now. And I live in Washington, D.C., been there since 1978. A lot of things have changed. A lot of things have changed in New York and Cleveland and Washington, D.C., and I'm sure Atlanta. So I appreciate you all coming out today, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to participate in a tradition as long and as rich as the Crown Forum. I'm especially honored to be the first National Union president ever to be a featured speaker in this series. So let me start by taking a few minutes to tell you about my union, the union I'm proud to represent as president, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. We're a large union, one of the largest in the country, largest public service union in the country, 1.4 million members strong, providing public services all across America. We are the everyday heroes. We call our members the everyday heroes because they are truly everyday heroes, providing essential public services to the citizens of this country. And they're everyday heroes more than ever, based upon what they've been experiencing and what they've had to do since this pandemic. AFSCME members have stood on the front lines under some of the most difficult and dangerous working conditions imaginable, working in the public service. We work in your schools, from Head Start to K-12 to the university level. We worked in your hospitals and museums, your courthouses, and your libraries. We are EMTs and 911 dispatchers. We're home care workers. We're child care providers. We work with individuals with disabilities and society's most vulnerable, marginalized people. We inspect the bridges, manage the parks, and work in recreation areas. We pick up the trash and make sure you have clean, running water every single day. You'll see us plowing roads in the winter and even lifeguarding at the neighborhood pool in the summer. We make your cities, your towns, your neighborhoods happen. Those everyday heroes every single day. Now, it's unsung, unglamorous work. Never made anybody rich and famous, but that's not why public service workers choose public service as a career. They choose because it's an opportunity to serve a cause bigger than themselves, because it's more than a job, it's a calling. These are the very jobs that for decades have allowed African Americans to build a better life in a country that slammed doors of opportunity in our faces, in the past and sometimes presently. Dr. Hewitt mentioned that I was from Cleveland. When I was growing up in Cleveland in the 1950s and the 1960s, yeah, I'm that old, okay? there were essentially three viable pathways to the middle class for Black families. You could work for the industrial manufacturing mills that were the lifeblood of so many Midwestern communities. Black families moving up from the South, going to Ohio and Michigan and Indiana for better jobs, for a better quality of life, better wages, better working conditions. You could work for the United States Post Office, or you could work in public transit. Those were the three areas in Cleveland and a lot of the Midwest where Black families were able to achieve just a little piece of that American dream and be able to make decent wages and have benefits, retirement security. Now, what did those three areas have in common? The steelwork, the mills, the post office, public transit. Those jobs all came with a union card. Workers were represented by a union. My dad was a city bus driver. Because he was a member of the Amalgamated Transit Union, our family, my brother and me and my mother, we were able to have a reasonably comfortable life. My mom didn't go back to school until my brother and I were older. And that's when she went back to school to become a professor at the Cuyahoga Community College. Before that, she took care of us, as happened in so many African American families. It's not like we were living on easy street, not by a long shot. We had our trials and tribulations and the difficulties associated with raising a family, but we had some measure of economic security, economic stability. My dad was paid living wages, had a good health insurance program, a family health insurance program because of belonging to the union and having a seat at the table to negotiate wages and working conditions. And my dad was able to retire and continue to live comfortably for the rest of his life because of the union and what the union was able to do in negotiating good contracts. I have no doubt that many Morehouse students stand on the same kind of shoulders, and sturdy shoulders they are, muscled up by the labor movement, understanding the importance of the labor movement, but many don't. And it's up to us to educate the public and talk about the real need to have a counterbalance against the mighty corporations or governments who we work for, so workers, the average worker, can have that seat at the table. The labor movement has a long history of leaning into the struggle for civil rights, economic rights, racial justice. Beginning in the 1920s, A. Philip Randolph organized the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, helping rail employees of the Pullman Company overcome a union-busting boss and become the first majority Black union to be chartered by the American Federation of Labor. Now, I want to be clear. It doesn't mean there hasn't been racial tension within organized labor throughout the years. But going back decades and to this day, labor has put skin in the game when it comes to racial and social justice, and we continue to do so. For example, you may not know this, labor helped underwrite the Montgomery bus boycott in the mid-1950s. United Auto Workers provided resources that allowed Brown versus the Board of Education to be brought before the Supreme Court. Labor, collectively, supported the March on Washington movement in the 1940s and 1960s, and even now when we're having demonstrations and rallies across the country. Today, labor, and specifically AFSCME, invest in a whole host of civil rights organizations and movements, the NAACP, I'm a board member of the National Action Network. I'm the treasurer of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. We work with not only the African American community, but the Latinx community, Asian Americans, and Pacific Islanders, LGBTQ plus people, and more. We have been major backers of trailblazing elected officials right here in Georgia and across the country, from Andrew Young, Maynard Jackson, to Stacey Abrams, who is a very good friend, and Senator Raphael Warnock. And we will support several of you when you step into a leadership role, when you graduate from this great university, when you run for office or continue to fight to give working people a voice on the job. That's who we are. That's what labor is about. That's what AFSCME is about. Now, the civil rights movement and the labor movement have historically shared common values, but also common enemies. The same powerful forces who've wanted to destroy us, destroy unions, also wanted to oppress African Americans. So-called right-to-work laws, which undermine the freedom of working people to band together in a union, actually have their roots in the white supremacy of Jim Crow, of the Jim Crow South. Right to work was specifically designed to stoke racial hostilities. A lot of people don't know this. To drive a wedge between white workers and black workers, to keep them from finding common ground and cause. Right to Work's most influential advocate was a guy named Vance Muse. He was a Texas oil lobbyist. In 1944, his organization was called the Christian American Association, and it was spearheading an anti-union right-to-work campaign in Arkansas. And one of their arguments was that right to work was essential. It was essential to maintaining segregation. Now, here's the language they used in their literature. And I want to quote this. If right to work failed, they said, and I want to stress, I'm quoting here, then white women and white men will be forced into organizations with black African apes, whom they will have to call brother or lose their jobs. That's the history of right to work that's in existence today. Around this time, A. Philip Randolph launched the March on Washington movement. The original march was set to take place in 1941, but it was canceled after one of the principal demands was met by President Roosevelt, the creation of a new commission to investigate racial discrimination in defense contracting. So it was delayed. It would be 2 decades later, the March on Washington finally convened, spearheaded by Randolph and another labor leader named Bayard Rustin. You may have heard of him. It was the most storied civil rights gathering in American history to that point. But it was really more than a protest against Jim Crow. It was also a demonstration for workers' rights and economic empowerment. The full name of the event, in fact, was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. That was the full name of the march. We hear about the March on Washington, but the full name of the march was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. The march's demands included not just voting rights and school desegregation, but also a higher minimum wage and major investments in job training. You know, the dream that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of that day wasn't just that we be judged by the content of our character instead of the color of our skin. It was also, as he outlined in the opening of the speech, that Black people no longer live on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of a material prosperity. Dr. King had an innate belief and understanding that racial justice could not be separated from economic justice. Those two are hand in hand. They're really one and the same. And that strong unions were essential to creating both. Dr. King believed that in his heart and in his soul. How can you overcome segregation without overcoming deprivation? How can there be racial emancipation without economic opportunity? How can there be freedom unless there's freedom from want? That takes me to 1968, one of the signature moments in labor history, in civil rights history, in American history. 1,300 proud African-American men in Memphis, Tennessee, decided that they had had enough, and that they not only wanted to fight and needed to fight for better wages and working conditions, but to fight for dignity and respect. Those men were represented by AFSCME Local 1733. They faced every single day brutal, oppressive, degrading conditions on the job. They earned poverty wages. They were called boy. They were essentially working in a modern day plantation. In February of that year, 2 of the workers were crushed to death by a malfunctioning sanitation truck. A gruesome tragedy that could have been avoided if the city had heeded the workers' demands to provide safe equipment for them to operate. That was the galvanizing moment when those workers came together and said, enough is enough. And we've got to make our voices heard, whatever it takes. With their families, their community, and their churches behind them, the sanitation workers went on strike. And I think you know this story. They wanted the city to recognize their union, but also to recognize their basic humanity, their worth, their value, and the fact that they were men. It was an act of astonishing fearlessness for African-American public employees to go on strike in the South in 1968. That was huge. Folks said that it would never be done, but it happened because collectively they came together. That's exactly what they did. They came together. They went on strike. They marched in the streets, braving tear gas and nightsticks under a simple, defiant, and powerful slogan: I am a man. Now, at the time, Dr. King had launched a Poor People's Campaign. More than ever before, he was putting issues of economic justice front and center in his work. So he was drawn to the sanitation workers' struggle, traveling to Memphis to show his support and solidarity against the wishes of his advisors who didn't want him to travel to Memphis, to engage, to support that strike. He declared in Memphis that all labor has dignity. To him, this strike represented everything that the next phase of the civil rights movement had to be about. That's what he felt strongly. Everyone knows that this was his last campaign. One night after delivering his iconic mountaintop speech at Mason Temple in Memphis, he was assassinated as he stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. And a few weeks later, when the community really was together and all of America watched this tragedy, The strike ended, with the city accepting most of the sanitation workers' demands. Now, a few years ago, we can never forget about our history, or we won't understand our present and our future. A few years ago, AFSCME marked the 50th anniversary of these extraordinary events by launching a campaign called I Am 2018, the 50th anniversary of the strike and the death of Dr. King. We thought it was critical not just to look back at the past, but to take stock of where we are in the present and to create a roadmap for the future. Instead of just commemorating, instead of just looking back at Dr. King and the sanitation workers with admiration, we needed to look to them for inspiration. And to plan a strategy to move our communities forward. So it was more than a commemoration, it was actually a call to action. And we had thousands and thousands and thousands of people in Memphis recreating the events in Memphis 1968 and urging and asking people to re-engage in their communities. It will be a call to action to work for change at the grassroots every single day, neighborhood by neighborhood, block by block. A call to action to fight both poverty and fight prejudice. A call to action to connect the Memphis story to today's challenges. A call to action to summon the courage of the sanitation workers in the ongoing struggle for economic and racial justice. I don't have to tell you that that struggle is ongoing. You know it, you see it, you feel it every single day. Our work is unfinished. That systemic racism is alive and well, unfortunately, in our country. The violent deaths of so many African Americans, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and so many others, are a devastating reminder of that enduring fact of life in America. But I also believe that these horrific tragedies have awakened more people to the reality of racial injustices. They have risen to a new wave of activism that gives me hope for the future. But that activism has got to grow, and it's got to continue. That activism is based on anguish over generations of entrenched racial inequalities and underinvestment in communities of color. It's about disparities in healthcare, disparities in housing, disparities in education, which have been made worse by this terrible virus called COVID. It's anger about a rigged economy that privileges people already standing on third base, while millions of people of color can't even buy a ticket to the game. You know, I have 3 grandsons, 6 years old and younger. And I got to tell you, it's unfortunate, but I have to sometimes lose sleep at night thinking about the trials and the tribulations that they will face every single day. I remember having my dad talk the talk. You know what that was. He would tell me, you know, there's some things you can do, but other things, man, don't even get involved with because you're going to be treated differently. Me and my brother, we would have to listen to that. He would have that talk to us. I had that talk with my 2 sons. And isn't it unfortunate that my 2 sons are now going to have that same talk with their sons? There is something wrong with that picture Now, I want my grandsons to grow up in a country where they don't have to be afraid to walk or drive in their own neighborhoods or anyone else's neighborhood for that matter. I want them to become men in a country that affirms that Black lives matter. At this moment of reckoning on race for the entire nation, I promise you that AFSCME's voice will be front and center, just as it has been throughout our proud and long history. Because the fight for civil rights is part of our DNA, and it will continue to be a part of our DNA. The entire labor movement has a responsibility to root out explicit and implicit bias wherever we see it. We have a responsibility to do that. And let me tell you something, and I'll be truthful about it. That includes within our own house. We've got to do it within our own house as well. As proud as I am of my union's record, proud as I am of AFSCME's record, we need to take a hard look in the mirror at ways we as a union are internally falling short of what we say, of our ideals. How can we make sure that diversity, equity, and inclusion are ingrained in the institutional culture, a part of all the decisions we make and priorities that we set? At the beginning of the year, I established a new committee on racial equity, comprised of local AFSCME leaders from across the country, to do a deep dive on these issues. If we're telling other folks to do it, we've got to do it too. We got to mean it. Their work is guided by the core conviction that we can't just pay lip service to these principles. We must live them every single day. We've got to be the change we want to see. It's not enough to be advocates for racial justice. We've got to be practitioners of racial justice. And good intent isn't enough. There need to be measurable results. I want to stress that. There needs to be measurable results. But it's not enough for AFSCME's voice to be front and center. We need your voice to be front and center. The movement for racial and economic justice needs your energy, needs your activism, it needs your intelligence. Now, I know a Morehouse education is a powerful thing. No matter what you do with it professionally, my call to action for you is to take your responsibility as citizens seriously. That starts with voting. Starts with voting. If you think your vote isn't important, ask yourself why some people are trying so hard to take it away. Now, I want to repeat that so it sinks in. If you think your vote is so important, isn't so important, why do you think folks are trying to take it away? In Georgia, in Texas, in state after state across the country. Make no mistake about it. There's an orchestrated effort engineered by the same political forces who oppose civil rights, who oppose labor rights, to disenfranchise people of color. Hundreds upon hundreds of voter suppression bills have been introduced across the country just this year. It's all based on a ruthless and immoral calculation. The folks behind this effort know that they lose when more people participate in the political process. And they know that they can't win a fair fight. So they're trying to rig our elections instead. They are going to bed at night thinking about this, and they are waking up in the morning thinking about this. Make no mistake about it. We can't let that happen. We, all of us, can't let that happen. You know, John Lewis shed blood on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma 56 years ago, beaten within an inch of his life so that Black people could cast a ballot and be full partners, not 2/3, not 3/4, but full partners in American democracy. So there's no way in hell we can let these attacks on voting rights go unanswered. We can't do that. You can't do that. We've got to stand up and make our voices heard. That's what Stacey Abrams is doing here in Georgia and across the country with her Fair Fight campaign. That's what so many of us are doing collectively. Because this is really an attack on our democracy when you're trying to take voting away from us. But I'm asking you to do more than vote. That really is just the bare minimum. I'm asking you to be advocates. I'm asking you to be activists. I'm asking you to mix it up and get in good and necessary trouble, as John Lewis always said. I'm asking you to be forces for change in your communities. You know, I always say this. Democracy is a contact sport, not a spectator sport. You've got to be engaged. You just can't talk the talk, but you've got to walk the walk. So get engaged. Raise your voice. Pull up a seat at the table. We need you. We need you there. We need you to take charge. I would love if some of you became involved in the labor movement. I've been working at AFSCME for about 45, 46 years now. I started when I was 10 years old. But if you're interested in working for a union or a progressive organization, as the old saying goes, let's talk. Because we're searching and we're looking for people that will carry that mantra. The truth is, we are building and growing support every single day, especially among young people. Unions have a 77% approval rating among people ages 18 to 34, according to the last Gallup poll. And we're in the middle right now of a rising wave of worker activism. You're seeing it, you're reading about it every single day. The hashtag Striketober is trending on Twitter as legions of people are walking off the job or threatening to do so. They're fed up. They're tired. And they want to fight back, just as those Memphis sanitation workers wanted to fight back. Right now, across this country, more than 10,000 UAW members employed by John Deere, coal miners in Alabama, the folks who make your Fruit Loops and Rice Krispies at Kellogg, healthcare workers at Kaiser Permanente in California and Oregon, they're all raising their voice and showing their power. That's what we must do. We can't be shy and we can't be afraid. We've got to be bold. Got to do the right thing. These workers are insisting on getting their fair share of the value that they created. There's nothing wrong with that. Getting their fair share of the value that they created. They are standing up to the boss and staring down injustice. Now, I want to be clear. I've been interviewed on TV and the radio and in the press. And some people say, well, they're just going on strike because they don't want to work. Well, let me tell you something, and let me be clear about this. The decision to strike is not a decision that you take lightly, because you are risking your livelihood. You are not being paid to provide for your families when you are on strike. You may have a strike fund that doesn't even come close to what your normal salary is. So it's not easy when workers collectively decide that they have had enough, that they have gone through every avenue to try to resolve workplace issues, to increase their wages, better benefits, better retirement. It's not easy when they say, we aren't moving, and we've got to take the ultimate action. And that's what a lot of workers across this country are doing. They're making a huge, courageous sacrifice in order to get the dignity and the respect that they deserve. I have never, ever crossed a picket line, and I will never cross a picket line because those workers are out on that picket line for justice and dignity. As a matter of fact, I join that picket line. I don't ignore it. I join it and support those workers. That's what all of us must do. You know, this is as exhilarating a moment as any to become involved in the labor movement. It's one of the best places to be if you want to lead social change. But it doesn't matter to me which specific issues, organizations, or causes you embrace, as long as you're part of the struggle for racial, economic, and labor justice. I want to leave you with the words of this school's most famous alumnus. In his 1959 commencement speech here at his alma mater, Dr. King urged graduates to see all of us as, and I quote, caught up in an inescapable network of mutuality. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. That's what he said. And he went on to say that we must rise above the narrow confines of our individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity. All humanity. The individual or nation that feels it can live in isolation has allowed itself to sleep through a revolution. And then he added this: there will be nothing more tragic during this period than to allow our mental and moral attitudes to sleep while this tremendous social change takes place. I think those words made in 1959, those are appropriate words for today. I think that advice still resonates more than 6 decades later. None of us should sleep through social change. The cause of social justice and the broader concerns of all of humanity are depending on you. I am not exaggerating. The torch must be passed. You've got to feel this in your heart and your soul and understand that you have the power to effectuate change. You have the power and you have the responsibility to engage in this battle for yourselves, for your families, for your community. We must continue to fight. We must continue to make our voices heard, and we should never back down. The cause of social justice and the broader concerns of all humanity are depending on you. And you know what? I feel real good about what you're doing. And I'm sure I'm going to feel better every single day because that activism is growing, especially among young people. And you're saying enough is enough, and you aren't going to take this anymore. Thank you for being a part of this movement. Let's get the job done. Thank you very much.
I have to do a time check. 11:48. We have 2 minutes to wrap up. I think what we're going to do is go ahead and wrap up. We will be having lunch out in the atrium. So President Saunders is more than happy to talk with us during lunch or right after we get started. So unless there's a burning question right here, maybe there is one and we should take that. Okay, then I think I will just say furthermore that I want to thank AFSCME for the support that they've given to ICLS. We are one of the organizations that they are helping to stand on its feet. And we have a number of our faculty here. I won't call names here, but I'm very happy that we're also represented in the audience. So everybody, please come on out, have some lunch, join the conversation. Thank you for being here. Okay. Okay.
Hello. All right, we're going to get started shortly, but just remember no eating. You can take the food back with you, do whatever, but they have strict policy on eating in the auditorium. So I want to thank you all for coming to the programs, and hopefully we can continue this engagement on campus and really get down to some of the other questions you all may didn't get answered today. You can, our next speaker, Bill Fletcher Jr., will be introduced formally. But we really want to engage you all in thinking about life after Morehouse and really understanding what the right conversation about democracy is. Like this whole issue of wages and hours and the whole issues of a voice at work. There's several ways to kind of think about it in different industries, but one thing is for sure, collective voice makes a difference. And so we, in society, they never really talk about labor, unions, and they never really talk about how these rights have come about through struggle. So our program, International Comparative Labor Studies program, will help you all kind of reimagine what life can be, reflect on what it was, and really, as you guys move forward as Morehouse men into your future, really understand that, labor and voice matters in the workplace, and that corporations and some folks be chasing dollars and things of that nature. And, you can, through the information that you decide that's important to you, will make a difference. And you'll see social justice and economic issues are real issues for underrepresented folks in the workplace. And this whole now issue of equity and critical race is going to be really important for your generation. So we hope that you all will stay engaged with us moving forward through this program, because this is a new program at Morehouse where we want to bring a critical voice for workers' rights and social justice and really give you all an ability or provide the space for you all to think critically about, minimum wage laws and why they vary in certain parts of the country. And as you all heard here, the minimum wage in Georgia, right? Minimum wage in general. So why this policy is set at a level that they know people can take care of their families. So we definitely hope to keep you all engaged, especially those who are freshmen. We hope to spend some time with you, and even those who are seniors, juniors, or sophomores, and even once you become an alumni of this great institution, stay engaged in this process, because Brother Fletcher would talk about it, but democracy matters, but your voice matters, and the lack of voice also matters as it relates to your economic interests and your rights interests, because rights, as we know it today, can be taken away. So I'll let Bill get into that whole what would have happened conversation. Did we start?
I don't know, but I came out to say hello to Mr. Fletcher one more time. I'm so happy that you're here. Mr. Fletcher is my editor from the Global African Workers online journal. So I work with him, I think, on some of the more difficult things in uniting workers internationally. So today I think we're going to have the pleasure of hearing him talk about the situation right here. And also, Mr. Fletcher was among the people who helped me think through how to have ICLS, because we had a number of conversations in 2017 at the time we were founding it. So I just want to say welcome. I'm so glad that you're here.
Thank you very much. Dr. Hewitt, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a special honor to be speaking here at Morehouse, part of the Atlanta University complex. My mother's father taught at Clark, Atlanta, until 1947. His name was William Stanley Braithwaite, and you can Google him. He was one of the most important pre-Harlem Renaissance African-American writers, poets, anthologists. He was sometimes described as the terror of Boston. He and my great-grandmother lived in Arlington, Massachusetts, right outside Boston. And they described him as a terror of Boston because of his impact on the literary world, that he could make or break people. He was a major mentor of people you may have heard of, like Robert Frost, the poet, Count Cullen, Alain Locke. All of these Harlem Renaissance people, he was an amazing person, and I knew him for the first 8 years of my life. In fact, he bought me my first comic book. And he was a complicated person on many different levels. He was very close with Du Bois. They taught here at the same time. And he was overall progressive, but race was not something that came through in his poetry. And that's a whole other discussion which we could have at some other juncture. But I start there because, by the way, he never finished high school. And he was a professor here. And that's not because they lowered the standards. He was what's called an autodidact, a self-taught person. So obviously I'm very proud of him. But I was thinking on the plane coming down here about him because I wanted to talk about history. You see, most of you, I would put $1 to a donut, have never heard of William Stanley Braithwaite. And what we have to understand about history is that history is never a settled matter. It's not like things are resolved and that there are famous people and they'll always be famous. That what happens in history, there's a constant struggle that takes place in history. And that struggle involves everything from how we understand certain individuals and their contributions, how we understand events, what individuals are important, who are not, what events are important. So there's this constant battle that's going on about history. And this is not a view that is presented to us in most of our academic settings. You get this idea that history is settled, that everyone understands this is the way it was, but it's not like that. And we're going through a period right now in this country where that becomes clear. This whole battle around so-called critical race theory that the right wing has moved is not about critical race theory. First of all, the people that are using that as their attack point in the Republican Party and elsewhere, most of them, I would wager, have not a clue as to what critical race theory actually is. They are using it the way in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, anti-communism was used, the label of communism. They're using it as a label in order to smear a certain school of thought, to make it unacceptable in any kind of discourse. So what is it? What exactly is going on? So first of all, critical race theory is something that developed in the 1970s in law schools, in the legal realm. And it basically was saying that it is important to factor in the ongoing impact of race on society. That it's not just that there was slavery and everything else was hunky-dory. It's not that there was just Jim Crow segregation and then everything got better, but that there's this long-term impact of race and racism that works its way into the structure of society. Now, for most of us, that's like, okay, yeah, and so what's controversial about that? Well, what's controversial about that is if you want to deny that there's a problem of racism. If you want to basically accept what Ronald Reagan was articulating in the 1980s, that the problem of racism is over. There is no systemic racism. There's only problems between individuals. And if Black folks can't get themselves together, that's Black folks' problem. It's not because there's a system of racist oppression. You see, and the right wing would like people to believe, they particularly want white people to believe it because it makes white people feel better. I mean, if there's no systemic racism, then when they drive through our communities and our unemployment is double theirs, when they look at housing and we're unable to get the kind of housing that most white Americans are able to get, when our wealth is a fragment of that of white people, they can just say, well, that's the fault of black people. They're not working hard enough. They're not worshiping God enough. They need to come back to Jesus, right? Instead of understanding that the system has been squelching us repeatedly, and that while Jim Crow segregation may no longer exist, the systems of racist oppression continue in this society, and they play themselves out in almost like what's called a perpetual motion machine, a machine that has been started, it was switched on, it does not need a controller to turn it on and off because it's hardwired into the way that the system operates. So the battle that's going on right now, allegedly around critical race theory, is really a battle about the truth. What is the truth of US history? Was the United States formed as a settler colony where the intention of the settlers was to wipe out the indigenous people? Was that true or was that false? Was the United States instead formed by these Europeans that sort of found their way over here? They were looking to get away from religious persecution, get a better life. There really wasn't anyone of any significance here. And so they came and they built this great society. I mean, was that what happened? The battle over history continues, and it's never resolved until one side or the other is eliminated. And I'm using that term eliminated very carefully because I'm not suggesting that you go out and do something to physically eliminate anybody, but I'm saying that politically, as long as you have a significant force that holds power and articulates a certain vision, then this thing comes back and it recurs. When I was in my teen years, I grew up in New York, and I remember feeling very proud because there were these red, black, and green flags of Black liberation flying all over every Black community. And I said, I am so proud of my generation for coming up with the Black liberation flag. Well, actually, we didn't come up with the Black liberation flag. A guy named Marcus Garvey did in the 1920s. But this was wiped out of our history, just like the memory of my great-grandfather was wiped out of history. And so what happens with each generation is that you are tasked with rediscovering your history. That's what happened. I hate to tell it to you. You're tasked because the other side is always trying to push the clock back. And right now, this whole fight around critical race theory is a fight to push things back, to get us to believe that this society is not what it is, to get us to believe that the Battle of the Alamo in 1836 was a battle that was carried out by courageous Texans fighting for liberty, as opposed to that it was carried out by slave owners and pirates that were breaking the law of the Mexican Republic and wanted to secede in order to expand slavery into Texas. Two very different understandings of the world. That is what confronts you. And this battle around history is symptomatic of the growth of a very, very dangerous political movement that's called right-wing populism. And right-wing populism is a term that describes a movement that argues that society is divided between them and us, the people and an elite. But the way that they define the elite is usually in racial and or religious terms. And you hear this, and if all you have to do is listen to the words of someone like Donald Trump or Steve Bannon or many other people, and you hear that basic message. And it's often subtle, and other times it's not so subtle. Right-wing populism is like a virus. I call it the herpes of capitalism, because when the capitalist economic system weakens, when there's a crisis, an economic crisis, and particularly a fiscal crisis, that's when you see various forms of right-wing populism emerge. And you see it come out particularly within white America, where they're challenging the idea that the United States is anything other than a white republic. And so part of the battle around history is the notion to try to reframe the history of this country and suggest that this is a white republic and that everyone else is nothing more than a guest, welcomed or otherwise. That's the movement that we're up against. And the movement is very racist. It is sexist. It is authoritarian. It is a movement that basically argues that the future can be found in the past. And so for right-wing populism, they have what's called a critical image. They have that moment that they look to and say, that's what society should look like. And there's two periods that basically is critical for them. One is the 1950s, and the other is during the Confederate States of America, neither of which were particularly good times for African Americans. In the 1950s, from the standpoint of the right-wing populists, and you can hear this again, Trump is not the problem, he's emblematic of the problem. But you hear it in his voice when he's talking about the role of women, for instance. In the 1950s, their attitude is, in the 1950s, men were men, boys were boys, women were girls, Black folks knew their place, Latinos just sold tacos, and Asians just had Chinese restaurants, and that was the end of the story, as far as they were concerned. But that since the 1950s, as a result of our movements, just as President Sanders was talking about, we have changed this country in very dramatic ways. And there's a lot of white people who are suffering because of the larger economic system, and they're looking for someone to blame. And it is much easier to blame us than it is to blame the rich. And this movement has become very, very powerful. It is very important. It's trying to push things back. And added to that, it is armed. This movement is also to be noted by its irrationalism. And I want to give a few examples of that. I think a lot about this in the context of the COVID pandemic and what's happened, where many people, including people of goodwill, have responded to actually right-wing populist messages about the pandemic. For example, people saying, I'm not going to get the vaccine because it's an experiment. Well, it's actually not an experiment. And when you start digging into it, you understand that scientists have been working on the COVID viruses for years, which is one of the reasons that they were able to move quickly, relatively speaking, in order to develop a vaccine. It's not an experiment. Or people that will say, well, it's my body, so I don't want to have to get a vaccine. Well, if you fly on an airplane, you have to wear a seatbelt. They're not going to let you sit on an airplane and not have the seatbelt. If you're driving a car, you wear a seatbelt. If you're driving a car and you get to a stop sign, you stop. Otherwise, there's a penalty to be paid. So what exactly is the difference? But on top of that, what this thing about your body? Well, let's think about it this way. And this is a question, my wife doesn't like me to ask questions like this, but she's not here. So my question for people that don't want to get vaccines is, so basically you're saying you want the right to kill me. That's what you're saying. It's not that you want the right to take care of yourself. You want the right to kill me or to kill my granddaughter. So let me just ask this. If you infect my granddaughter, can I whack you? Is that self-defense? I mean, really, let's talk about it. See, that's when I'm talking about the irrationality of this, but it appeals to people who are anxious, who are scared, who are looking for quick and easy answers. Right-wing populism comes up with them. Or another one that I love about the vaccine. Don't get the vaccine because there's homing devices in the vaccine. How many of you have heard that one? Right? Well, let me tell you about homing devices. What the hell do you call this? Right? And how many of you have this? Or how many, no, let me put it in a different way. How many of you have refused to have this because you know it's a homing device? So then what the hell are people talking about a homing device? But again, you know, it's like, if you don't think, it's like, wow, man, that sounds like powerful stuff. I'm telling you, it appeals to the irrational. But right-wing populism does other things too. Let me give you another example. When it comes to race, all of humanity originated in Africa. We all know that, correct? Everybody, all of humanity originated in Africa, in Southern and Eastern Africa. There is no doubt it, right? It's resolved. The question is resolved. But when you had the rise of slavery and European colonialism, there was a real problem that the Europeans had, because they found that they were encountering these incredibly advanced civilizations that weren't created by Europeans, whether it was in Asia, Africa, or when they came over to the Western Hemisphere. The Spanish was so blown away by the Aztecs and the Incas that they ordered the literal destruction of buildings and all kinds of things, because they could not conceive that these short brown people could have created something that was more in advance of Europe. Well, this creates a problem in terms of this whole notion of white supremacy. How can you have white supremacy if Central Americans have a civilization that's greater than yours? Or if Egypt started way before anything happened in Europe? Well, then they started inventing something, and one of the notions was Atlantis. How many of you have heard Atlantis? Okay. So Atlantis, and then there was a continent allegedly in the Pacific called Mu. Now, the idea of Atlantis grows from something that Plato wrote, and it's probably related to a massive explosion that happened in the Mediterranean. But the myth of Atlantis was expanded over time along these lines. That once upon a time, there was this continent in the middle of the Atlantic, and it was basically made up of white people. And this continent was very advanced, and it just excelled. And then there was a catastrophe, and it went down beneath the Atlantic, and all these Europeans spread out to all different parts of the world. And that's why the Egyptians and the Incas and Aztecs had advanced civilizations, because they couldn't have done it on their own. Europeans had to do it. So for years, people were searching for Atlantis. They're still looking for Atlantis, and they can't find a damn thing in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And so at a certain point, great scholars said, well, wait a minute, no. These civilizations were the result of the people themselves. It was Africans, it was Asians, it was Latin Americans, what we call Latin Americans now, the indigenous, that came up with these advanced civilizations. They weren't the result of Europeans. So this idea of Atlantis was demolished, except largely in science fiction and some other things. But then in the 1970s, there was a guy named von Däniken who wrote a book called Chariots of the Gods. Anyone heard of that? Okay, cool. So von Däniken, he takes this notion. I mean, you can't make this stuff up, right? And he basically says that that aliens from some other solar system came to Earth and brought advanced technology to people on Earth. And that's how Africans, indigenous in the Western Hemisphere, and Asians got their advanced civilizations, because it was aliens. Now, being a great Star Trek fan as I am, I'm sure that he's talking about the Klingons, right, that came. But you see what I mean? It's irrational, but it was this deep desire to identify that it would have been impossible for black, brown, and yellow people to have developed something that was more advanced than the Europeans. Now, for many Europeans, this is very, very comforting. And that's one of the features of the right-wing populism, providing comforting answers to people and the answers are fundamentally wrong. So instead of helping people understand that we live in a capitalist society that is brutal towards most of its people, that is completely amoral, that is, it is absent morality. Its morality is profits, pure and simple, and eliminating any obstacle to profits. That's our society. And that society is crushing people, destroying people's lives, black, brown, yellow, white, red, whatever. Instead of people focusing on that, right-wing populism takes them in a different direction and focuses them on the idea that no, you as white people would be doing much better, but it's those black folks that have gotten in your way. You would be much better, but it's those Latino immigrants that have gotten in your way. You'd be much better, but all these Asians have come over and they're taking all these jobs. And so you as white people, your life your living standard is declining or stagnating. And instead of blaming the system, let's blame another group. Or further, that there are Jews that are controlling everything. This is another very important theme in right-wing populism, that Jews are behind everything, that Jews are manipulating black folks. Jews manipulate this, they control the economy, when there's no foundation for that. But it's comforting. It's comforting. Conspiracy theories are very comforting because it doesn't force you to think. It doesn't force you to think about what's really going on in this society. It gives you quick and easy answers. And that is what we are confronting now. We are in a very dangerous situation. The 4 years of Trump, building off of a growing movement, is trying to turn the society back. It is essentially attempting to reassert the notion of the white republic. It is attempting, their ultimate objective is to change the US Constitution. And it is quite possible that within the next several years, there will be enough states where the state legislatures will have passed legislation such that a constitutional convention could be called. And nobody knows what could happen then because there's no precedent. There's only been one constitutional convention in US history, and that was in 1787. The Constitution has been changed since then by amendments. If there's a constitutional convention, however, all bets are off. You could change the tax code, you could eliminate the right to unionize, you could completely codify the restriction on women to control their own bodies. Any number of things could happen. That's what the movement's objectives happen to be. That's what makes this moment so especially dangerous, because the other side is not playing. They have that when you have a situation where millions of people refuse to accept the reality of the 2020 election. I don't mean agree with it, but accept the reality. You understand the depth of the problems that we're facing right now. The people could actually continue to assert that Trump won when there's not a shred of evidence that would support that conclusion. So that's the situation that we're facing. I'm going to be speaking more about this weekend at the Black Men in Unions Conference. But what I'm interested in doing, in the interest of time, more than anything, is engaging in a discussion with you all. And so what I wanted to do is to put aside plenty of time for any questions that you had or comments, debate, whatever however you'd like to proceed. But we have the time. So I'm going to stop there for now. Questions? Yes. You have to take off your mask so I can hear you. Okay. Yep. Yeah. So what we have to understand is that we're not building a struggle in South Africa, Zimbabwe, or Algeria. We're building it in a place where we are maybe 15% of the population. So I can count. This is something that really affected me when I was younger and I was becoming radicalized. I could count. And I realized that we ain't going to be able to pull it off by ourselves. Now we can glamorize that, right? And we can fight heroic battles. But in order to win, no. Now, that doesn't mean talking to the people that were involved in the coup attempt on January 6th. But to really answer your question, we have to start in the 1600s. And we have to understand why racism came to exist in North America. Because if you don't get that, then a lot of other stuff doesn't make sense. The settlers that came here from Europe immediately were confronted with a labor problem. And the problem was who was going to do the labor, right? So a lot of us, we were led to believe that, these nicely dressed Europeans came over and they were just starting farms and stuff like that and everything was hunky-dory. No, there were rich people that came over, but they weren't the people doing the work. They needed people to do the work. And so where did they get the people? Well, the first set of people they got were they tried to enslave the Indians, and that met with mixed results in North America. They forced, and this is something that may come as a surprise, they forced massive numbers of Europeans to come here as indentured servants to work. They worked in slave-like conditions for 7 years and then were freed, and they could own land. They were forced. I'm talking about Irish prisoners. I'm talking about the poor people in London and Wales were forced to come here. Many of the people that Lerone Bennett writes about this in The Shaping of Black America, many of the slave ship owners, people that would go to Africa ultimately and get slaves, they began their work grabbing Europeans and bringing them to North America. But there weren't enough. And there was also, so the Europeans were, particularly the British, I'm focusing on that. Latin America is a different story. If we have time, I'll get to that. But the British then start going to Africa and bringing over Africans, forcing Africans to come here. In the beginning, most of the Africans that were brought here were indentured servants. There were also slaves. That does not mean that any Africans came here voluntarily. But after 7 years, they were entitled to freedom. The British then encountered a second labor problem. The second labor problem was that you had all of these laboring people that were treated under horrible conditions, indentured servants and slaves. And they start revolting. And if you look at the 1600s, it's a period of continuous revolts against the plantation owners and others. The greatest of these was the Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia. And it was in that context that the British understood that they needed to implement in North America what they had started doing in Ireland, which was the construction of race and racism, the two things going together. The notion that populations would be divided according to this arbitrary pseudo-scientific notion of race. And thus you ended up having, in the course of the 1600s, the construction of racial slavery for Africans. No racial slavery for Europeans. Indentured servitude for Europeans. The objective there was to drive a wedge between these populations to make sure that they could not join together to overthrow the elite. That was the objective. So the growth of capitalism is linked to the construction of race and racism. It's not that like white people just started off racist, and it's not like white people or Europeans had no knowledge of Africans. Europeans and Africans had been interacting for centuries. They knew each other. They knew the different empires. West Africa was known for its wealth in Europe. It wasn't like some Portuguese guy just got lost and stumbled into what we now know as Guinea. They knew about this. They knew the area. West Africa, however, was in decline at that time in terms of the great empires. And it was ripe for the picking. And so the slave trade in West Africa happens at the opportune moment for the Europeans. This is a long answer to your question, but it's really important because what we've got to understand is that it's not like genetically Europeans are just this way. The system has been constructed in a certain way, and it has different devices that keep dividing populations, whether it's on who gets jobs, who gets education, who gets what's healthcare, whatever, on top of the ideology of white supremacy. Right? So you got the practice of white supremacy and ideology. So then what does that mean? It means that we as people of African descent have to figure out who out there are our potential allies in order to change this system in its fundamentals. So when you say that we've tried different things, you're absolutely right. We have tried different things, but many of the things that we've tried have made an assumption that there's something decent about the capitalist system. And I'm saying there's nothing decent about the capitalist system. It is toxic. It is amoral. Its objective is to squelch. And it needs racism. Just think about the game musical chairs. Just think about that, right? So in musical chairs, you have always one less chair than our people playing the game, right? But somebody controls the music. So you got when the music is on, you're walking around the chairs. When the music stops, what happens? What happens? I can't hear you. Right. Everyone's dashing for a chair, right? Who dashes to take over the music? Welcome to the United States, brothers and sisters. That's the game that's being played. Instead of us focusing on who controls the music, we focus on the chairs. And we end up fighting each other. And then we start saying, oh, you know, it's these Latinos are getting in our way, or these Asians are coming and setting up this, or whatever, right? And the white folks are saying all kinds of nonsense, right? And we're fighting each other instead of saying, well, wait a minute, wait, stop, hold it, hold. Who controls the music? Right? Who set up these chairs in the first place? That's what we've got to ask. And that's about building the kind of majority that we need in order to transform the country. What's that? You build organization. And it relates to what, and then I saw your hand, bro. I'm going to get you. It relates to what President Sanders was saying. See, I've been thinking a lot about the Black Lives Matter explosion after George Floyd, after his murder. And it was, on one level, it was historic in terms of the number of demonstrations. But here's the problem. What has it left us with? What new organizations do we have that are continuing and pushing these demands. See, people got out in the streets. Some people died. Other people were arrested and brutalized. Very courageous. But what are we left with? The question of defeating our opponents is a question of organization, because we're never going to have more money. The oppressed never have more money than the oppressor. I mean, just think about it, right? We're not going to have the same number of television stations that they have. All we got is organization. And if we don't build organization, then we're toast. That's the answer. So we build organization and we start looking around for people that have a common interest with us in resolving these problems. And part of that is what the President Sanders was talking about in terms of unions, but I think that we have to go deeper than that. That's not a criticism of him. It's just that we've got to do more. We've got to transform the system. We've got to change the way we think about economics. We've got to change the way we think about the environment. That's about all I can answer right now. You had a hand, and then you over here. Speak again. Thank you. Thank you. Feel free to use the example. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, I think it's absurd. I mean, it's like telling people you can't teach about gravity, right? I mean, that's essentially what they're saying. You can't teach about gravity. No, see what they're trying to do, and they're trying to do it they're trying to be really slick, right? And basically saying that we're trying not to increase the hostility out there. And it's sort of Rodney Kingism, right? Why can't we all get along, right? So it's basically saying that when we start talking about race, that makes us racist. And I've even had white people say that to me. They said, Bill, if we just stop talking about this shit, right, then we'll be able to get along better. And it's like, no, it doesn't work that way. I mean, that's like saying if you don't talk about electricity, you won't get electrocuted if you touch the third rail, right? It's absurd. But the point is that they are trying to dismiss our analysis of what's going on in the system. You know, like there's this great book, The Color of Law. It's about housing segregation. I recommend you read it. I mean, it is unbelievable. And what you see is the role that governments have played and private entities since the 1930s in increasing housing segregation. And this has an impact on everything, including our wealth, etc. They don't want us talking about this. Because see, if you start talking about these problems, then ultimately the question comes down to how do you repair the damage? How do you repair? That's what reparations, you know what I mean? But how do you repair the damage that was done? And that's why we've got to oppose that. No, we've got to, see, I don't even argue with any of these characters about critical race theory. I'm arguing about the truth. I mean, is it true that 95% of the indigenous in the Western Hemisphere were wiped out in the first 200 years of the arrival of the Europeans? Is that true? Right? Is it true that the United States provoked a war with Mexico in 1846 in order to grab northern Mexico? Is it true? Right? See, we have to talk about what the truth is. And that is where this constant battle. This is why W.E.B. Du Bois wrote the great book, Black Reconstruction in America, which was in 1935. It's still in print. And he was basically setting out to document what happened after the Civil War, not what was found in that movie, Birth of a Nation, right? But what actually happened. And it's brilliant. That's what we have to do constantly, because the other side is trying to dismiss us. Now, I see a couple of hands. You had a hand back there, and then a couple of hands up here. Yes, back there. And speak up. You got to stand up and yell. Mhm. You need to come up here and speak. That's exactly right. And in fact, what you just said is something that President Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, said is a very famous quote about how if you can convince the poorest white person that they're better than the best colored person, that was the term he used, you can put your hand in his pocket and take his money. And he said, hell, you do enough of that, they'll open their pockets for you. So continue. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, good, really, really interesting point. So that's going to be part of the answer, right? Which is that we actually need alternative media that is reliable and is not spouting half truths, conspiracy theories, etc. But we also need to engage people that don't necessarily look like us in common struggle. I mean, for example, the planet is facing a environmental catastrophe. There is no certainty humanity will get out of the 21st century civilized. And therefore, it's in the interest of billions of people to try to figure out what do we need to do. That crosses racial boundaries, religious boundaries, ethnic boundaries. And it raises certain questions about the economy. What kind of economy do we have? Should ExxonMobil be basically playing such a dominant role and suppressing the introduction of clean technology? Or do we need to basically cage these kind of companies so that we get them out of the way and they're no longer able to run roughshod over the rest of us? See, I think there's a lot of people out there that would really unite with that. And in doing those discussions, though, it's not like we should run away from race. Because one of the things that we've got to understand is a long history to this. In the United States, there have been movements that have emerged over time that have brought people together across racial boundaries. But if you don't understand race, the race card gets used by the other side and the movement splits. In the South, the populist movement in the 1890s is an example, right? And so one of the things with any movements that we're building, we've got to be talking about race. Now, this does not, I always like to say, and I say this especially, well, I say this in front of all audiences, this is not about whether we like each other. I don't give a damn whether you like a white person or not. It ain't about that. It's about whether you're interested in winning. That's it, right? If you don't like the white people, that's fine. That's between you and God, right? But if you want to win, then that's between us. And we've got to figure out, how do we actually mobilize and create a block where we can push back against this irrationality that we see out there. See, because January 6th, that ain't the end. That may be the end of the beginning, but it's not the beginning of the end. And we've got to be thinking about, how do we actually mobilize people such that we can eliminate that threat and transform this country and ultimately this planet. And so it means thinking very differently. And I realize that, it's like uncomfortable. And I don't mean that in a condescending way. I mean, most of us would frankly rather not have to talk to white people about this. It's like it's a headache, right? But if you want to win, then you got to figure out, how do you get allies? That's why I say it's a numbers game. There was a hand down here, 2 hands down here. Yes, go ahead. That's right. So this is good. And for those that didn't hear it, what I understand the brother raising is, fundamentally, when you're up against issues like racism, do you come at it or do you seek to avoid it? Right? And we are often told to try to avoid it. I'm definitely of, you take it on. How you take it on is a tactical matter. So you have to decide in each circumstance what's the best way to do it, because it depends on what your objective is. So for example, let me give you an example in terms of on interpersonal. Have you all heard the term microaggression? Okay, so little background. The notion of microaggression was elaborated by a Black theorist named Dr. Chester Pierce in the 1970s. He was at Harvard. And then for some reason, people stopped talking about it. And then it reemerged. But basically, the idea of microaggression, a microaggression is a form of behavior that is subconscious, that is the result of the kind of the way that society has been structured racially and the way that plays out personally. So an example that was very common was, less so now, but was very common. A Black guy and a white guy are approaching each other on the street, and the Black guy gets out of the way of the white guy. And that did not happen because the Black man said, "Oh, here comes a white guy, getting out of the way." And it didn't happen because the white guy said, "Here's a Black guy, he's gonna get out of my way." It was very subconscious. And where did that come from? Well, because once upon a time, if you were African American, if you were Mexican, if you were Indian, and if you were Asian, if you didn't get out of the way, you died. It was simple, right? You died. You were killed. And so when you have that kind of practice, people then have to figure out ways of surviving. So then, a little kid is with their parents, and the parents walk out of the way of somebody. They're not necessarily thinking about it, they're thinking about survival, and the kid learns that behavior. Now, there's all kinds of microaggressions that happen. I was listening to something on radio on my way to the airport this morning about this brother that's in jail in Louisiana. And Louisiana had a law that was recently made unconstitutional that was you didn't need a majority to convict somebody of a crime, a criminal crime, a crime. And so this guy had been convicted. There was a jury of 12 people, 2 were African American. They voted against his acquittal, but 10 people voted for him. So he was convicted 25 years ago. They interviewed this white woman who was a jurist, was on a jury, and they asked her about this, and she said, "Well, he came into court and he was very, very sure of himself, and very, smiling and he seemed overly confident." And I didn't need the radio commentator to tell me anything after hearing that, right? Because all of us have heard something like that, right? About, you're being a little bit too smug. You're being a little bit this or a little bit that. That's a microaggression. The person on the jury, I don't believe intended to be a racist, but they were. And do you need to confront that? Absolutely. And it's not like you can necessarily confront that by knocking someone upside their head, but you do call it out. It's like pull the emergency stop cord. We have to have a little discussion. And that's when tactically you got to figure out how you're going to do it. Then when you go beyond individuals, we have social struggles. And frequently we're told as African Americans, we're told, well, let's not really talk about race. Let's talk about things that bring us together. The problem with that is that it's sort of like trying to hold a bubble underwater. You can't. And when you try, the bubble always surfaces, and it may surface in places you're not expecting. And that's the thing about racism, right? You try to keep that suppressed, it's not going to stay suppressed. It's going to surface at some point. And so we've got to talk about that. And it's an uncomfortable discussion, just like it's an uncomfortable discussion for men to have discussions about sexism. It is. It is uncomfortable for me as a man, and I think of myself as I'm on the left. I'm very aware of issues of male supremacy, but sometimes a sister will have to call me out on something, and it's uncomfortable. It's not like I can't turn it into a joke, but it's got to be done. So yeah, it's a long answer, bro, but I appreciate the question. Sure. Yes. 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 That's an interesting question. So let me answer by saying, have you heard of the Koch brothers, the Koch companies, KOCH? These ultra right-wing business people. They and others have been some of the main promoters of the idea of a constitutional convention. The way that it started was that they wanted to institute what's called a flat tax. And the flat tax is where there's one tax rate. That's what everyone everyone pays, and there's no deductions. And it's a tax on income as opposed to wealth. So that means that if you're wealthy, but you're getting like a minor income, you're not going to be taxed on that wealth, you'll be taxed on that income. So that's what they wanted. That's how it started. But then what started to happen was it was almost like a pile-on. Other right-wing groups had other agendas. Like there were those that were against a woman's right to choose, and they wanted to put in a constitution that there would be no abortions permitted. Then there were those that jumped on and said, we got to get rid of affirmative action. No affirmative action, maybe even no recognition of race, right? And what's been happening over the last, I think roughly about 20 years, maybe a little bit more, is that very quietly in state legislature after state legislature, right-wingers have been moving these pieces of legislation that call for a state convention, a constitutional convention, very quietly, right? So that, other people don't get aware and start fighting back. I think that there's somewhere between 3 and 5 states now away from being able to call it. So the problem with the Constitutional Convention then is that there's no precedent of how decisions would get made. How would the delegations be chosen? You wouldn't be able to appeal a decision to the Supreme Court because you're changing the Constitution. So we could quite literally come out of a Constitutional Convention, the United Theocratic States of America, where Christianity was defined as the state religion, no other religion was permitted, right? That there were no unions. Any number of things could happen. And at that point, I think we probably will have a civil war. I think some people would move, but I think that a more likely scenario is that all hell would break loose. And we're real quick. This is why, I'm sorry. Oh, cool, that's fine. I say the issue of civil war not to scare you, but to scare you, right? Because we have to understand that the people that are arrayed against us are not simply using harsh language. As they demonstrated on January 6th, they are prepared to overthrow the government and change the Constitution. And they've got guns. And I don't mean pop guns, right? I'm talking about Uzis, rocket-propelled grenade launchers, mortars, 50 caliber machine guns, right? And there are many of them that want a race war. This goes back to the question about what do we do? If we don't build a majority, we're toast. And that means every election becomes important in terms of who gets elected. There's no room for passivity. There's no room for sitting back and saying, I don't like any of these candidates. No, the Republicans have demonstrated that they are the party of authoritarianism. They're the party of dictatorship. And do you sit back? See, because after Hitler took over, there were a lot of Jews that thought, well, Hitler's rhetoric was just rhetoric. Things turned out differently. Last question. So there's a few things. One is that we've got to do continual internal education and not relying on the school system to do that. We need to be holding what the Panthers used to have, political education classes on Saturdays, where you're actually talking with community residents, workers, et cetera, about what's going on in society. People have got to get that. The second thing is that we've got to be building all kinds of organizations, not just one organization. But I'll give you an example. The whole post-George Floyd movement. there were a number of initial victories around police brutality. But there were some problems. One was that there were two slogans that came out of that movement that were very confusing: defund the police and abolish the police. These were not very popular in most of Black America, truth be told. And part of the problem was that they were confusing. When you have to explain a slogan, you've got the wrong slogan. That's the bottom line. It's a very basic principle of organizing. If you have to explain a slogan, you got the wrong one. In the Russian Revolution, their slogan was peace, bread, and land. Everybody knew what that meant, right? They didn't have to go through any long oration about that. Everyone. But when you start talking about defund the police, well, what does that mean? What does that mean about my daughter who just got held up, right? It's like that's where it gets complicated, right? So part of the problem was after that, we needed deeper political education and we need organization. After police brutality, cases of police brutality, and I've seen this for 40 years, there's almost always an upsurge and then the upsurge dies down. And the other side is just waiting for it to die down. And usually we don't have any organization that continues to push. If we want to demilitarize the police, which is what I think we've got to do, then we have to have organization that is fighting to demilitarize the police. That the police have to stop looking like they're in Kabul, right? And they need to be people that are actually public servants. And so that means organization. And it means pushing, and not giving up. And that's the thing I want to leave you with: education and not giving up. We're in this for the long haul. There are no silver bullets. The other side, they relish us getting tired. I saw this in the 60s and 70s. I see it again. They just wait for us to slow down so they can come back and kick us in our rear. We can't give them that luxury. It's now our time to turn them around and kick them in their rear. And we actually can do it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Great, thank you.